Just a quick trigger warning. In this paper, I discuss the feminist anti-rape movement and the development of new intervention models for sexual assault survivors by psychiatrists. But I open with a discussion of victim blaming in pre-1970s psychiatry, so just so you guys are aware. If you want to take a minute to read this is an article on medical management of rape victims, circa 1962. I put this up here because it's kind of indicative, it's telling, it's a middle-of-the-road kind of presentation from this period, kind of showing how rape victims were theorized by psychiatrists, right? And I'll come back to this in just a second. So the title of this panel is Contesting Marginality. The topic that I'm going to talk about is the development of the first counseling models for rape survivors when none existed. This is in a period before trauma was widely recognized in the way that we understand it now by psychiatrists. And what I want to highlight in this paper is the key role that consciousness raising played in the development of these models. So before the anti-rape movement began in the early 1970s, psychiatric understanding of sexual violence was generally focused on perpetrator psychology. It was heavily psychoanalytic and often concerned, as we see here, with the woman's role in bringing about what happened. So to make a very long story short, psychoanalytic thinking that theorized women as naturally masochistic, it was pervasive in psychiatric literature and made its way into criminological literature, which by the end of the 60s had made its way into forensic textbooks used by lawyers and police, as well as writings by jurists and legal thinkers. So this interacted with a number of, this sort of belief in the innate masochism of women, interacted with a number of other factors which, as you can imagine, made rape extremely difficult to prosecute by the end of the 1960s when the women's movement started to become active on this issue. So this is sort of the preamble to the story that I'm telling. Now, the story of the development of these new counseling models is complex, and as I said, I want to highlight the pivotal role of consciousness raising and how it, in addition to representing a huge epistemic and eventually, very soon after, ontological break from, previous models, it led quite directly to three very important developments. One was the creation of what eventually became rape crisis centers, which were centers that provided services to victims and support navigating the legal and hospital systems, as well as counseling. Secondly, the very first counseling models at those centers, right? And then thirdly, how it led to the first meaningful long-term rigorous study of rape survivors, which produced not only the first guide for how to counsel rape victims, but also a new diagnosis that you guys may be familiar with, rape trauma syndrome, which eventually was incorporated into the definition of PTSD, which was first articulated in the DSM-3 in 1980. So key to all of this is a combination of grassroots consciousness raising, adaptation of existing models of counseling, such as they were, and then also a process of trial and error. And I should say, I personally see this as quite a feat. I worked as a rape crisis counselor for a number of years, and it just strikes me how the people who were starting to do this work, as we'll see, were just working in a vacuum. There was nothing. So I think it's quite an incredible story that has not received enough attention. So the watershed moment is the start of the women's movement activism against sexual assault, which started in earnest in 1971. Does anyone know about a group called the New York Radical Feminists? So basically they kicked off the anti-rape movement when, out of their own small group consciousness raising activity, they realized that nobody really understands the contours of this problem. Why don't we hold a public speak out? And this is an account from Susan Brown Miller's In Our Time, describing how her personal sort of entry into this issue. Now, she wrote a book called Against Our Will, which sort of broke the story on rape and historicized it and really put it in the minds of the public consciousness. So basically, she had to come to this through hearing about it, right? And she says at the end, listening to so-and-so, I took out the names in the account, was the moment when I started to change my mind about rape. What she did was propose a public speak out. This was a strategy that abortion activists had used previously, in which women would come together and speak very publicly, invite people to hear them talk about this issue. So in January of 1971, around 300 women gathered to listen to a group of speakers share their experiences, and again from Brown Miller. In all, 30 women were inspired to speak out that afternoon, and their words were to reverberate far beyond the confines of the tiny church. So many varieties and aspects of rape had been revealed in St. Clement's. Sexual assault was a crime of power that crossed lines of age, etc., etc. All of us were reeling from the new knowledge. So basically, I mean, the story that emerged is that the issue is pervasive and poorly understood, much more common than anyone thought. Husbands, boyfriends, acquaintances, coworkers could all be perpetrators, right? After this event, they planned a conference on the issue, and via high-profile public events like this, and also the attention that this generated in the feminist press, the anti-rape movement really got rolling. They also coordinated with NOW, who formed a task force to analyze and then change the state laws around the country. So this is when it began in earnest. So one of the earliest responses, the pre-rape crisis center responses, were groups called rape squads, which I don't know what they were thinking with the name, but were essentially patrols through dangerous neighborhoods and volunteer-run teams to which survivors could reach out for help. And assistance with going to the police and accompaniment with hospitals. Some of them even engaged in vigilantism, as in they would find a perpetrator, track him down, and then confront him, which, as you can imagine, backfired rather quickly and then was abandoned. But groups began to form around the country that engaged in anti-rape activism and then also offered resources for survivors. And these two things were very tied at the beginning of the movement, right? The activism sort of faded away in the late 70s when a lot of these groups were forced to take money from the state and sort of adopt a more a less collective structure. So many of the earliest organizations emphasized the importance of self-defense. The DC Crisis Center quickly seized on the idea of creating a hotline, which was going to be volunteer-run. The New York Women Against Rape made a decision to reach out to and work with the police, something that the DC Crisis Center decided against. So they still had a very tenuous relationship with the system, right? Do you want to work with it? Do you want to work as an alternative to it? Do we even want to speak to the police? Because for a long time they did see them as the enemy, and with some justification. So the question of counseling also came up. Many of the volunteers had no experience with counseling, and in those early years, right, they struggled to come up with an approach. So the DC Crisis Center and New York Women Against Rape both reached out to psychiatrists and therapists for their input and advice. The one model that was kind of available and relevant was the Kaplan model of crisis intervention, which, rather than looking at the survivor's psychology and saying, okay, what did you do to bring this about, intervened by saying crisis or trauma, it causes a state of disequilibrium, and the goal of counseling is to bring the survivor back to a state of functioning. And so it's interesting because before 1974, these centers, these groups, are struggling to come up with a way to help survivors and give them counseling in the absence of any models. So some of them tried a consciousness-raising approach, as in getting survivors to come meet in groups, and that quickly backfired. Some of them tried, the earliest sort of interventions that the DC Crisis Center came up with was actually a product of consciousness raising, as in they brought survivors together in a room and they simply spoke about what did and didn't work with them, both when they spoke to psychologists and counselors and also when they encountered the system. And just as an example, this is one example of the kind of trial and error you see at the DC Rape Crisis Center. However, after the first month, it was clear that the discussion group approach was not working. This may have been due to the different expectations of participants, discomfort with an unstructured approach, the fact that the great diversity of women in any particular group militated against free discussion, and so they had to look for alternatives. So it wasn't until 1974, when this book, Rape Victims of Crisis, was published, that crisis centers had a published source to work from, or any kind of manual for dealing with these survivors. Before this, the DC Crisis Center had made this pamphlet that it basically mimeographed and sent off to anyone who requested it on how to start a rape crisis center. But this quickly became the go-to book for counseling victims in the aftermath of rape. How much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay, great. So consciousness raising was really key to the development of this book too. So in 1972, so 1 year after the Speak Out event in New York, 2 junior professors at Boston College commenced the first systematic study of rape survivors out of Boston City Hospital. Anne Walbert Burgess was a psychoanalytically trained nurse. Linda Lytle Holmstrom was a sociologist. Holmstrom had been to consciousness-raising groups, had attended consciousness-raising sessions in Cambridge, and from this, realized like, oh my gosh, this problem, like Brown Miller, is not what I thought it was, and there seems to be absolutely no information about it. Why don't we do a study? And so they conducted a study slash counseling program out of the emergency room of Boston City Hospital. So for a year, Boston City Hospital would phone them whenever somebody who reported having been raped came in. And they'd be present during the emergency room visit and to the visits to police, and accompanied them to court. And the material that came out of the study was incredible. Not only this manual, but also a critique of the institutional encounters that women had after they'd experienced this kind of violence with police and in hospitals and in the court system. And then also, far and away, their most well-known contribution is the articulation of rape trauma syndrome, which is the constellation of symptoms that many survivors of sexual violence experienced in the aftermath of rape. And then it's actually still taught. It's not in the DSM, but it's still used in clinical settings and in training for rape crisis programs. And it's I think particularly interesting because neither of them were psychiatrists, but they managed to publish their paper on rape trauma syndrome in the American Journal of Psychiatry, which gave it real weight, real legitimacy, and I think contributed to it being integrated into PTSD when it came out in 1980. So it's interesting that this process also, I think it's interesting to me that this process also involves some trial and error. Initially, they would ask the women to return to the hospital for counseling, but they found, obviously, that many of these women were reluctant to do so. So then Burgess adopted a program that involved phone counseling and interspersed that with some home visits. And in creating their theory, they borrowed from Eric Lindeman's work and Gerald Kaplan's work, and basically cobbled together a program for counseling these survivors. And a version of this program, its descendant, I guess, is taught to rape crisis volunteers today. So prior to these developments, the existing literature was sparse. The psychoanalytic ideas that theorized women as naturally masochistic and therefore at least partly to blame for their attacks pervaded the psychiatric, legal, and criminological thinking. The publication of Victims in Crisis was the first ever manual, and it found a really eager audience in the burgeoning network of rape crisis centers that were developing around the country. And I think I'm just going to leave it here for you guys. So thank you very much.